All right, folks, sorry about that. I am back, and I'm going to have to do this without slides because technology just doesn't like me today. It is actually 10:36 here in the PM in Canada, so hello from Canada. My name is Dave Lewis. I am a Global Advisory CISO with Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco Systems. And with the security field being what it is, I mean, I have been very fortunate that I have had all sorts of different roles over the course of years. And along the lines, I've learned a lot of lessons. One of them is learning how to do a presentation without my slide deck. And yes, I will make these slides available afterwards. So first and foremost, how we see ourselves is we see ourselves in the security profession in many ways as a superhero. And the idea here is we are champions for protecting our environments, protecting our families, protecting people at large. And we tend not to look at things quite the same way now for obvious reasons, where what we used to see as our adversary has sort of morphed where we're now working from home and we have to deal with our kids crawling all over us and all sort of interesting things like that. And it's really made things very interesting. So with the idea here of we can be zero trust heroes is an interesting notion in that, or that we are all zero trust heroes, is that we are all contributing to this to a large extent, by virtue of the way we are protecting our organizations. But no security story is good without an origin story. And much like any hero, we always hear about the origin story. So if we go back in time, we look at different types of malicious software that we've had to contend with as defenders, from Brain in 1986 right through to the computer AIDS virus, which was actually a CD that was delivered, and then you had to send cash. I think it was $189 to a PO box somewhere in the United States. And then jumping through to 06 with Archivist, and then Fake AV, WinLockers, Crydex, and CryptoLocker, and so on. And there's been no shortage of malicious software that has gone along the way. And then we got into, the 2014-2015 era of dealing with Dridex and dealing with this, where it was stealing information from your system from screenshots and injections and form grabbing and things like this. All of this was heavily using, leveraging the account of the user that was logged in. Now we jump into 2016, we go right through and we look at how Dridex actually accounted for roughly 50% of all financial ransomware. So we've gone from the AIDS virus, such that it was back in 1989, with the CD being distributed and you had to put that in and send money, to Dridex, which was actually doing this as a service. By May 2016, as per the FBI, it was dealing with about 100,000 attacks a day and infecting roughly 3,000 to 5,000 computers. And this really started racking up the costs, 10 million in estimated losses at that point in time. So as a defender, what are you to do? Well, we have to look at the different types of things that we can do in order to better protect our environments. When we're dealing with things like email phishing and social engineering, which the attackers will use in order to gain access to your systems, the attacks of we once had the one where it's like, oh, yes, you send your money to a PO box and yes, we'll make everything all right, but we'll send you the key, to now where you actually have to spend a certain amount of Bitcoin and hopefully you'll get a key that'll unlock your system. But if you wait long enough, you can usually get the key provided to you through one of the good certs out there or a researcher that is of a positive bent. Now, these applications will primarily target local apps for the most part, which are usually slower to patch. And the attacks will go far and wide with more and more access problems. And the risk is evolving when we look at it in various types of reports like the DBIR and so on, where we're looking at the users and the devices and how they are being breached. Most of the data breaches, according to the latest DBIR, was 81% of the breaches involved compromised credentials. Now, for devices, we were looking at about 70% of devices involved in data breaches were compromised. And this is a number that stays relatively high year over year. So how are we going to do a better job of this? Well, we have to look at other things, other ways of doing authentication. Passwords are something that really tend to complicate matters in many, many ways. We've been dealing with passwords since about 1962 when MIT rolled them out for one of their applications there in order to protect students' compute time. And this has really been something that should have just been a temporary measure. And I'm sure that you're going to love my cat dancing in the background. So I apologize for that. I didn't think I had him in the room. But as we're going along, we have to look at a better way to do things. So we're moving away from passwords to biometrics. We're looking for push technology, using wearables or biometrics or hardware tokens. There are all sorts of ways to do things better. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you are having a solution, and a zero trust solution that is, where you are protecting your system using something that'll check your OS level on your system. You're checking the patching, checking the current, is the Face ID enabled? Is there a screen lock? Because this is where we need to start going. We have to do a better job of securing our mobile devices. So, question for you. If I went around the virtual room, and I can't really tell how many people are in here right now, but if I went around the room and I asked everyone, what is love? I can guarantee you I'll get a different answer from every single person. Zero trust has really evolved into that as a way of looking at it, because people have different answers for that. The idea here is zero trust is about reducing risk in your organization. And with any organization where you're dealing in a certain type of perspective, you really want to look at how you can reduce the risk. You have to deal with less fires to put out. And when you're looking at zero trust, you're dealing with, everything is on fire. And I'm glad to see that your kitten is now tapping the screen. This is actually kind of cool. I wish I could say I trained him to do that, but he's just jumping in. So when we look at zero trust, the idea here is that everything's on fire. Everything is a point of contention. We want to make sure that we are securing our environment in a way that you're only granting access where it's absolutely needed, because things are going to go wrong. Necessarily always a malicious actor. Sometimes it's a case of code that worked well in development didn't go well into production. That happens far too often. As a security practitioner, we often feel like we are sitting on a chair being rocketed across in front of a moving train, and this is a real frustration. So back in about 2003, 2004, we were dealing with a paper that was put out by the Jericho Forum. Now, this particular paper talked about deperimeterization, and this was really the forerunner to what was later called zero trust, and that was a term coined by an analyst at Forrester in 2010. And I have a lot of conversations with CISO roundtables about this, and more often than not, they say, oh, this is just a buzzword. Yes and no. It's a buzzword in that it got people to pay attention. But zero trust is about reducing risk and getting back to dealing with the core fundamentals. Now I can't stop looking at my cat. Jeez. And we go through time, we look at there are better ways to do things as we go through it. And because the IT landscape has shifted, and it's even more prevalent in this current age with the pandemic, where almost every company out there in the world has some sort of a remote workforce in some capacity. We have to look at, from a zero trust perspective, we have to look at, we're enabling multi-cloud access as an example. We have to enable BYOD because there are companies out there that just didn't have the hardware available to them in order to supply their staff to be remote. I spoke with one company in Southeast Asia. They literally didn't have enough laptops for their call center, so they took all the desktops off the desk and sent them on there. Oh dear, and sent them on with them. So the idea here is really about breach prevention. We want to make sure that compromised credentials are not a currency, and we have to take that away from them. Yes, if I can train the cat, I can tame my network. That's a good point. And phishing is a real problem as well, because if we look at it from the perspective of something as simple as multi-factor authentication, we're then nullifying so many of these attacks, where the attacker will try to breach a website as an example. They get usernames and passwords, but if they can't get the other factors, they're not going to be able to leverage that for their own end. So we used to look at the traditional perimeter as, I have a firewall, everything is fine. Well, let's be honest, everything was not fine. And we have to switch to talking about it from a zero trust perspective, where anywhere an access decision is being made is where our perimeter is today. And when we want to talk about establishing zero trust, we have to look at it through a tiered approach. First off, you want to confirm all your user identities. You want to gain access visibility. You want to ensure device security. And then you want to enforce contextual access policies, user device combinations. And then ultimately, you want to talk about, securing all access to your applications. So for example, if you're based in Sydney and you have an application that you are using for doing your business that is web enabled, you don't want to have some random Canadian and his cat connecting to your system and logging in and checking your email simply because he found a password. Thank you, Penelope. Yes, who does need slides when you have a cat? Oh dear. You don't simply trust something because it's inside your firewall. Years ago, I was working for an organization where we had a penetration test done. And when we were looking through the results, the CIO looked at me and said, "It's okay. We have a firewall. We trust everybody on the inside." And in retrospect, that was actually not a good thing, because we found that there were at least 2 people on staff that we should not have been trusting because they were up to a nefarious end. These are the kind of things you want to trust but verify, and you want to be able to track everything. Now, we all like to be environmentally friendly, but reusing passwords is not a good idea. So in previous organizations that I've worked at, we did a lot of research into compromised websites, and the attackers, what they would like to do is they'd get the usernames and passwords and then replay them against other sites trying to escalate their privilege. So reusing passwords is absolutely not a good idea. Now, rather than vilifying the users, which actually never works, it's quite counterproductive, you want to talk about enabling them to do their job better. You want to talk about democratizing security, giving them tools that are going to make it easier for them to get their job done safely and securely. You don't want to give them tools written by engineers for engineers. Now, for example, in Monty Python movies, you had good King Arthur coming up to the castle wall and trying to gain access. And think about it like this: if you saying, "Oh yes, my password is X," and they would say, "Haha, no, go away or I'll taunt you again." This really is the way it should be from a multi-factor authentication approach. Just because you have found the key under the mat in front of your house doesn't mean that the person coming through the front door is necessarily you. So before I ever got into computer security, I actually was doing a degree in archaeology, of all things. Long story for another time. Hopefully one day I'll actually be in person at AusCERT. That would be kind of lovely. But one of the stories that I learned from my time at that point, one of my thank you, Mandy. One of my favorite things at that time was a lesson about the sack of Rome. So in 410 AD, and I do tell this particular story a lot because I think it's rather poignant, the Visigoths attacked the city and they surrounded it, and they waited until the Romans ran out of food and water. Eventually, the Romans couldn't take it anymore, and they just threw open the gates, and the city was sacked. The attackers used their own paradigm against them. They were able to leverage their antiquated perimeter approach against them. So the idea of we have a firewall, we have a castle wall, we have a moat is really a deprecated notion that's demonstrably so for almost 2,000 years now. Somehow we missed that particular lesson from history. But the real lesson there is that castles simply don't scale. Pardon me. So here in Canada, we like to go for hikes a lot because, well, we can't actually go anywhere because we're all locked down. But one of the jokes that we would always say is that if you went out for a hike, you always wanted to be a little bit faster than the hiker behind you, just in case a bear came along. But nowadays, from a computer security type of approach, we're looking at it, there are bears everywhere. There's enough to go around. So we have to be more diligent about our security approach. We don't want to be the flaming sword of justice running around saying, how do we get to know? And yes, blessed are the ACL makers. The idea of the original way that people would look at InfoSec professionals was, they're always trying to tell us no. When realistically, that is a deprecated notion that we as security practitioners have gotten to the point where we are there to enable the business, to do things in a safe and secure manner. We don't want to just, fill their USB ports with epoxy and encase their computer in cement and drop it in the lake. That is not going to serve anybody's better interests. Now, we were, the Department of No, came from a place of, purpose. We thought we were doing the right thing. And as with everything over time, it evolves. Now, data breaches are something that is near and dear to my heart, and these are the kind of things that just keep on going. Now, AWS S3 Buckets, for those of you who don't know, please look it up. It's a data repository you can spin up with a web browser. These are excellent tools, but if you go to set one of these up, it says in big bold print, it says, do not make this public unless you know what you're doing. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But if you do that, then anybody can find this. There's all sorts of different scanning tools that can actually look for these particular tools, or particular repositories rather, and they can gain access to your data. And this is the kind of thing where the people that are typically spinning up these buckets are not necessarily security practitioners. It's more of a case of they didn't know what the potential damage could be. It's incumbent upon us to do a better job of educating folks on a wider scale. Because the perimeter that we think we have is actually quite porous. When we talk about HTTPS traffic, VPNs, RDP, DNS, email, what have you, all of these things are traversing our perimeters in the traditional sense. I go back very much to talk about what my boss, Wendy Nather, said. The perimeter is anywhere an access decision is being made. And this is very, very important, so much so that I repeat it in this talk more than once. Because the new perimeter, we're dealing with remote employees, we're dealing with hybrid clouds, cloud applications, personal devices, mobile devices, vendors and contractors, everybody connecting into our network. Now, with a zero trust model, we are looking at it from the perspective of dealing with the workplace, the workforce, and the workload. Or more succinctly, trusted users, trusted devices, and every application within your organization. So back in 2012, I started tracking database breaches as a hobby. Apparently, I have strange hobbies, but this is one of the things I was doing. And that particular summer, which I labeled the summer of breach for some particular reason, the biggest data breach at that time was 6.5 million records. That pales in comparison to what we see in today. Yes, the cat did overlook the Department of No, and he's moved on to the other part of the basement here. And the problem is with these data breaches is anybody can have them these days. It literally could happen to anyone. Like this particular frame grab that you'll see when I distribute the slides is I was working for a company where one of our sites was compromised, and they were a crew called the Root Beer Sec put up a new page for us, and we were just so happy about that. But this was a problem because this was a system that should have been taken offline. We had spoken with the group that was responsible for it, and they said, yes, we'll take it offline. And unfortunately, that did not happen. And I don't blame them for that. I blame myself and my own team because we didn't close that particular loop. It was all meant with the best intentions, but unfortunately, the road to hell is paved with that. Now, if we look on sites like informationisbeautiful.net, we see that data breaches are nothing new. They have been going on for a long time. If we go back about 4 years, we see just a whole host of them. And we're looking at orders of magnitude of 80 million to 76 million, 191 million records. And then we flash forward to more recently, the website informationbeautiful.net, which does data visualization, they couldn't They couldn't fit all of the information onto the web page anymore, so much so that they had to rejig things. They had to re-envision how the data was going to be presented. This is a real problem. So this led me to start wondering what kind of ports are open in Australia as an example. So as of yesterday, we were looking at just about 6.3 million ports that were open. That in of itself is not a big deal. You need them open in order to get business done, but you can be sure that a subset of them will have security issues. Now, as I scroll through them, I found that there was 58 systems that were online that were susceptible to Eternal Blue for a compromise. There was just under 3,000 systems that were still vulnerable to Heartbleed, and that's been, what, 5+ years now? And there was also 1,294 systems that were vulnerable to the Blue Key vulnerability. So what does all that mean? It means we have to constantly be iterating through and looking at the systems that we have towards the facing towards the internet. Sorry, it's late here and I'm tripping on my tongue. We want to go through and look at a trusted access security value proposition and how zero trust is going to help. We want to make sure that we're devaluing stolen credentials. We want to remove low-hanging fruit, like easily patched systems. And when I say easily patched, I mean something that should have been patched a while ago. There's no such thing as just patch it. It's never, ever that simple. Regression testing and all the rest of those fun things that people on the social media tend to think, oh, just magically patch it and it all goes away. It's never that easy. But you want to be able to complicate lateral movement through an organization because you don't want to make the attacker's job easier. Now, back in 2003, 2004 timeframe, one of the conversations I was having in the place that I was working at that time was talking about how we can make all laptops, desktops, and systems as bastion hosts. I did not realize at that time that I was talking about a zero trust type of perspective. And this was very interesting in of itself because I actually survived that meeting just barely because the system admins that would have been responsible for patching and maintaining all those systems damn near ran me out of the room. And thankfully, I escaped there quite unscathed. But here we are in 2020, as insane as this year has been, but zero trust is a real viable option. Now, when we're talking about patching systems in order to get our business done or setting them up, we move from the DMZ to the soft, chewy center in an organization. And what I mean by that is I've been in several organizations over the years where all the effort would be put into patching and hardening the systems that were internet facing, but the back-end systems typically would not be receiving the same amount of care and feeding, which has always struck me as odd. In one particular case, I found systems that were in a DMZ that were, I kid you not, had full installs of the Microsoft Office suite. And I asked, why are these systems running a Microsoft Office suite? And they said, oh, we had the license for it, so we thought we put it on there. And it says, you just managed to expand your attack profile there. We want to make sure that we're having a sensible discussion on how to patch these systems. Just because they are on the internal network doesn't mean they are not susceptible to issues. When we're talking about zero trust, we're talking about things like multi-factor authentication, network zone segmentation, asset inventories for users and devices. And every time we do something in a zero trust framework, we want to make sure we are going through as a game of increments. Never try to boil the ocean and do everything at once, because a zero is literally going to take you years. You would absolutely be a hero if you could pull it off in a year, but let's be realistic about this. We still have to be able to do business and keep the lights on. So if you're going to look at heading towards dealing with a zero trust approach, priorities as they sorry, I'm going to look at this. Yes, Olivier or Oliver. I apologize if I misspelled your name or mispronounced your name. Internal threats are absolutely key. But you want to determine your priorities within your organizations to make sure that you are approaching this in a way that makes sense for your business. Easy way to do it to get started is obviating the use for static passwords alone. You want to look at rolling out multi-factor authentication as one particular example, because this will reduce the risk in your organization. Because if your systems are attacked and compromised, how do you know that the accounts that are being used to access your networks are actually, in fact, the ones that are supposed to be there? Now, by all accounts, when you read about data breaches in various reports, there's usually a mean time of about 200 days before an organization realizes it's been breached. Think of the amount of damage an attacker could do with a legitimate set of credentials in that space of time, let alone in a day. These are the kind of things we want to make sure that we're taking that off the table and making it harder for the attackers to do their job. Now, we want to look at security best practices, and I always have a tongue-in-cheek when I hear that term because who's actually practicing, but realistically, you want to be verifying your users, verifying your devices, and protecting every application that you need in order to get business done in your organization. You want to also look at devices with poor security hygiene. You want to be able to say that when a device is connecting to your network, either by VPN or through a network gateway, that you are checking them to make sure that they are patched to current or N-1 or whatever your risk appetite is in your organization before they can attach to the cloud applications that you need or the on-premise applications they need in order to get business done. You don't want to be introducing any extra problems into the organization. Now with Zero Trust Access, you can look at it, for example, as the user makes a request to access an application. First, you have to check using multi-factor authentication to ensure that, yes, they are the person that they say they are. You want to evaluate the trustworthiness of the user device and its security posture. Then you want to enforce the policies that pertain to that user device combination and enable a secure connection at that point to the application. You just want to make sure that you're reducing the risk to your organization. So when you're looking at doing zero trust, you want to look at it from a perspective of how can I get started? Where can I go? You want to have a shopping list. You want to have an asset inventory. You want to look at user management. You want to make sure you have device management through uniform security policies. Defined repeatable processes are a big win internally to your organization because you can do this yourself. You don't need a vendor to do this part for you. This is something that will help reduce rates of incidents within your own organization. And then when you're collecting all the data from your Zero Trust, you're logging all the rest of it, you can look for user and entity behavior analytics. And then one of the key ones is network zone segmentation. Now, this is something that should have been done for the last 30 odd years, but let's be honest, not everybody does a really good job of this. Now, when I went through and looked at all those ports earlier that I was talking about, the 6.3 million ports that were listening in Australia alone, I found that there was a subset of them running SSH that I just randomly picked a few of them, and I found one in particular had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 10 different severe vulnerabilities that were affecting it. Now, think of that if that was in an enterprise. That could potentially lead to very serious issues down the road. So you want to make sure that you are not making it easier for the attacker by patching to current or N-1, and you want to make sure that you are encrypting all the traffic. You want to encrypt data at rest, data in flight, and we have to look at doing things in a better fashion. And what's a better way forward? How about using an open standard like WebAuthn? If you haven't read this one, W3C has put out an open standard. It was ratified about a year ago. And this is a way to move even further down the line away from static passwords to a passwordless future. And this is something that is viable today, where you are able to log into your smartphone, use the local device authentication, then it completes your connection to whatever website you are trying to protect. If you do nothing else today other than check out duo.com and cisco.com, make sure that you look up WebAuthn. It is an open standard. It is not a vendor-y thing at all. So, as I only have a few minutes left, I'm going to take a moment here to go back and sum up what we're talking about here. When you're looking at doing zero trust, it's about reducing risk in your organization and fundamentally reducing the costs in your organization. You want to assume that your network is hostile at all times, but you want to establish a trust engine. You want to reduce the threat surface and continually validate the authorization. You want to keep it as simple as possible. Now, I gave you a shopping list earlier, and I'm going to go back over it real quickly here. You want to build your asset inventory of both users and devices. You want to get a solid hold on user management. You don't want to have a user account in your organization that has been active for 10 years, but that person has not been part of your company for 10 years. These are the kind of things that unfortunately happen far too often. You want to be able to know what is on your network. Defined repeatable processes are a very, very good thing for any organization to help reduce risk fundamentally and reduce the rates of incidents. You want to look at user and entity behavior analytics from the data that you're collecting, and please, 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 network zone segmentation is a key thing. You want to be able to secure the workplace, the workload, and the workforce. Zero trust is an easy way to get you started for your superhero role. You want a reduction in risk, a reduction in costs, and an improvement of sleep. Fundamentally, what's not to love at that point? So, as odd as it has to give a talk without slides, and it's not the first time I've had to do this in my career, but I would like to say thank you everyone for listening today. And honestly, I do appreciate your time, and it's been quite a treat. So I'm going to say this out loud. Let me see if I can type this into the box here. Let's see, Dave. Whoops. I'm going to just type in my account, email account, and there we go. So I really do appreciate your time today, everyone. And if you want, you can drop me a line at gattacaduo.com, and I would be more than happy to talk to you about anything zero trust or any security related things at all. And yes, that was my cat Loki that made the cameo. So thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. Much appreciated.